Human groups are made of human systems. This show stands at the practical intersection of counterintelligence, trauma psychology, and systems thinking. My research focuses on how people, groups, and institutions lose the ability to see reality clearly, and what happens when decisions keep getting made anyway. I'm Kip Perez, and this has changed the game. If you're interested in being ready to deal with threats, you've probably read Left of Bang. You might know how to read a room now or how to recognize indicators before a threat becomes action, and these are valuable parts of the surface layer. And Left of Bang has become not only a book, but a part of the vocabulary surrounding preparedness and threat identification. My guest today is the co-author of that book and framework, Patrick Van Horne. He spent the years since it came out working on something harder, which is how organizations build the capacity to operate before failure forces the issue. His diagnostic work on organizational preparedness posture maps a spectrum that a lot of leaders might honestly struggle to locate themselves on. But his writing on talent retention in reactive systems is one of the more precise descriptions I've read of something a lot of people have lived, even if they couldn't explain it. I've lived it. Most of us have. So today we're going to pressure test some of this. And I'm going to ask hopefully some fascinating questions. Where does behavioral detection break down when the observer's already miscalibrated? Things like that. So Patrick's already done the operational work, and now he's doing the organizational work. And today I really hope to find the edges of both of those. So Patrick, thank you much for coming on.
Kip, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
So, okay, I kind of see three sections to this chat, and really it's just for the purpose because you have this huge body of thought, and I want to organize it in a way that listeners can follow. So you have the individual observer level, that's what Left of Bank started out as, correct?
Correct?
And then, that's the foundation of your work. So now we have the organizational systems layer, that's kind of where you're working at now. But lastly, we have failure conditions and limitations. And this is where I'm hoping to really push on some of the stuff and just kind of see what happens. Because chances are really good that my listeners already know what Left of Bang is. They probably own the book, they probably understand it. And you've already trained a lot of people in this in the last few years. So, first question, what is the most common failure mode you see on the individual level where maybe you have a practitioner who has technical skill, but they're still not getting the reliable results? What's missing?
Yeah, there's really two sources of failure that I see when we're talking about an individual person on the ground, observing behavior, looking for threats. And the first oftentimes comes from a lack of confidence in the system. And in the book, Left to Bang, we provide this framework that people can use to read behavior and recognize threats. It's establish a baseline. Once you know what's normal, then you can begin identifying anomalies, those things or those people that stand out from that baseline. And then you make a decision about what you're going to do about it. And one of the premises that went into the Marine Corps program was that we needed to make sure Marines could make decisions fast enough in order to keep up with the pace of combat and be able to act on our adversaries before we got attacked or before we were ambushed. And so one of the things that we teach, it's knowing when to stop searching for more indicators. And we refer to this as the rule of threes. When you identify three indicators that all lead to an anomaly or lead you to determine someone is an anomaly, you have enough information to act on them. And it doesn't mean decisions are perfect, and it doesn't mean there will never be an incorrect decision. But when we see people failing in this, oftentimes we see them trying to identify 5 or 6 or 7 different indicators to confirm and get to a level of certainty that what they are seeing does in fact make someone a threat. And at that point, sometimes it's too late to act. And so by the time you have certainty, you're probably past the point of being able to prevent an incident from occurring.
How does this come into play with or overlap, or maybe we're talking about a Venn diagram with OODA loop or mission command? It almost sounds like you're talking a little bit about a hybrid of both.
I think there's elements that come from all those different fields into the approach that we teach. When we talk about establishing a baseline for an area, we teach in the book, we refer to it as the 6 domains of behavior. That has evolved a little bit since the book was published. Now we talk about them in terms of 4 pillars of behavior, but they are a way to quickly make sense of the situation that you're in, looking at things like the collective mood or how people relate to their environment, looking at groups of people and looking at individual people. And what this really does is jump starts the orientation. It takes someone from being possibly a passive observer, a passive participant in the situation that they are in, and gives them not only indicators to look for, but also a process of establishing the baseline that they can use just to accelerate through those first few moments going into a new area. And of course, that orientation can expand and improve with more time and more factors that could go into it, but it gets people moving in the right direction.
Okay, so if we're talking about orientation, we are talking about from the body inside, you're talking about all of someone's experiences, all of their trauma, all of their beliefs, all of their everything, right?
Mhm.
How much does that internal state come into play when someone's trying to figure out what it is that they're seeing?
It's a great question. The Some of the most, I don't want to say gifted or natural observers of people, have oftentimes been people who have dealt with violence or dealt with trauma or dealt with, some really, tough circumstances in their life. Because they have been through those, oftentimes they are very attuned, to the people and the intentions and the moods and the emotions and everything about the people around them. And oftentimes those things that they are looking for that provide them that little advance warning or that little extra time to realize the situation might turn bad. Sometimes those behaviors are really hard to articulate, are hard to explain, are hard to share with someone else. And what the Marine Corps' Combat Hunter program did was establish a language and a terminology to those behaviors so that we could share them and teach them to people who did not have those same experiences. And so when we look at things like the way that we assess an individual person, every person at every moment in time can be in one of four what we refer to as clusters of behavior. Behavior shows that they are either dominant, submissive, uncomfortable, or comfortable. And those are based on a person's fight or flight response to stresses and threats. But we can teach someone, how do you observe those and how do you develop the ability to quickly recognize those clusters so that you can hopefully kind of bridge that gap between someone who maybe didn't grow up in an environment where they were constantly surrounded by violence and teach it to someone so that they can still make decisions objectively um, and in a way that truly supports the decisions that could either save their life or help them change the outcome of the situation they are in.
When you're
Did that
talking
actually
about,
answer your question, Kit? Yeah.
it absolutely did, and now I have more questions.
Okay. Yeah.
If someone is coming to this with that extra awareness, we'll call it, it is also possible to be, I guess, part of a spectrum, so to speak, where on one end, everything is a threat because of this experience. But where do you, where does that vigilance turn into distortion, right?
Hmm.
Because once you're coming out of that environment, if everything's a threat, nothing's a threat. And how do you, because obviously I'm sure you've had people come into your program, into your training that have these past experiences. How much do you find that it does distort them or distort their ability, even though they have these extra skills, so to speak?
Hmm. And there's two pieces that I want to hit on with this. The first being those experiences, and then coming back to kind of calibrating the responses. So if I don't hit on both of those, please uh, follow up with me. But in terms of the experience, I remember as a Marine infantry officer, I remember my first deployment to Iraq, and I remember being told by this really experienced gunnery sergeant who said, hey, when you do 3 or 4 deployments, you become really good at recognizing threats. And it's something I often hear working with police officers or security professionals today. Hey, when you've been doing this for 20 years, you become really good at it. And I remember hearing that in the moment and thinking, well, that's great, but there's a lot that can happen between my first deployment and 3 or 4 deployments down the road of being able to recognize threats. And one of the things that is limiting for that was the ability to articulate and bring these observations down into concrete, meaningful, tangible things that you could assess about someone else. And oftentimes, when you look at people who are just naturally gifted at this, they sometimes struggle to explain, well, why did that person stand out? Why did that person attract your attention? What made you, feel like this situation was going to turn bad? And when they can't articulate that, it becomes really hard to build a shared, level of situational awareness or understanding about an event. And so really, when we go back to the language and the terminology and the behaviors talked about in the book and on our site, it's to help shorten that process so you don't have to wait until you've done 20 years in a job before you become really good at something. And so the first piece is getting some of the things that those people who have the experience, who have been doing this for a long time, making sure that can be transferred to someone who is younger in their career and just starting out with this. But to your second point about people who bring in trauma and background, maybe with violence, when we go through the process, the goal is it always starts with establishing a baseline, right? So we think about this baseline plus anomaly equals decision structure. When you only focus on the anomaly, pretty much to your point, or very much to your point, excuse me, if everything's a threat, nothing is a threat. But things only attract your attention when they stand out. And to stand out, you have to stand out from something. And so a big part of our program is going back into, let's not try to find the threat here at the moment. Let's start by just establishing to a really specific level and a really high degree of clarity what is normal here. And once you can, or oftentimes, once you can get a person to define for you what is normal, and then turn their search only after that has been established to now identify the people who are not normal, you begin to just bring in a little bit more objectivity, or you begin to bring in some perspective of not everyone here is a threat. These are the specific cues in this situation that we are looking for. And sometimes that can help balance out, a person's perspective to make sure they're thinking about both violent and nonviolent reasons for the behavior that they're observing of the people around them.
You mentioned at the beginning that one of the biggest failure modes was lack of confidence. Have you seen it go the other way where confidence in this pattern recognition actually becomes a liability?
Absolutely. There are people who maybe jump to the conclusion very quickly, and it's always a balance, right? The When we think about the behaviors and the process that we teach, sometimes it can be seen as a very deliberate process. But by going through that, you do develop the experiences and the memories needed to, recognize behavior more quickly and then make decisions off of it. We also don't want to slow people down, though, either. And that's a really important balance that comes for the people who do have that experience. Even if you can't articulate exactly why someone is a threat, but you believe that they are, and you're beginning to take some sort of action to protect yourself, then we don't want to minimize that or slow that process down either. A person's instincts and intuition are very much a reliable process more often than not in terms of recognizing when someone is bad or someone does have violent or illegitimate intent. And so even when someone jumps to the conclusions, we might not want to suppress that, or if they're overly confident, but what we may talk about are the decisions they are then taking to validate and confirm, yes, what you observed and the intentions that you assessed are in fact valid. And so more often than not, when someone's really confident and getting right to the conclusion, we then just think about, okay, how are we going to prove that, validate that, to make sure that we are still acting rationally in the situation as well.
It sounds like what you're doing then, my brain's going in about six different directions. I'm trying to rein it in because I have questions and I have answers and I have all this craziness going on.
Yeah.
So it sounds like with you're saying, yes, your gut instinct is valuable and not but and you must be able to explain in a shared vocabulary. I can't just come to you and say, okay, that guy's a threat. I just know. Why do you know? You have to
Mhm.
be able, I have to be able to explain to you because he did X, because I see X, or what have you. And what you're basically doing is formalizing that process so that the average person is not only running off gut instinct, which is a valid and yet still sometimes unreliable process.
Yeah. Because one of the other things that I think leads into this, it's when you're an individual, you're a police officer, a security professional, if you are in a situation where you are taking lethal action to stop a threat, there should be, a high bar to making that decision. And so if you are unable to articulate what you observed and then explain the rationale behind it, it does become very hard for other people to understand how you got there, how that decision was made. And so, with the language and the terminology that were established in the program, it just starts to get people, understanding those observations using the same language. And when we talk about, every person can be categorized in one of four ways: dominant, submissive, uncomfortable, or comfortable. What we're describing is on the uncomfortable cluster of behavior. These are people who are acting nervous or anxious or shifty or jittery or furtive, and there's 1,000 different synonyms you could use that have different levels of meaning for them. But we bring it back to a cluster that, with a name and a set of observations that has come from science, they're not made up. And what it does is allow someone to explain, we observed this cluster of behavior. I got here by observing and assessing, these three behavioral cues. And against this baseline, that is why it stood out to me. And once I recognized that person stood out, here was the process that I went through to either validate or take action to protect people around me. And whether you're communicating that in a report or over the radio, or you're looking at, security camera footage and you're trying to explain to someone else, either this is why I took action or this is why you need to take action, without that language and without that terminology, it's very hard to create the same level of urgency in someone else. And so the goal of this oftentimes comes down to communication and making sure that people can act at a, fast enough pace and go through the cycle at a fast enough tempo or at a rapid enough tempo in order to, again, make decisions that, in the case of violence, you can get ahead of that attacker, you can stop them before something bad happens. But the articulation piece and communication, both before and after the fact, is a critical component to that.
Well, first off, I'm really impressed that you used the word furtive because it's not a word that I get to hear in general conversation. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And secondly, can someone go through your training and have the shared lingo and all of these tools and still be unreliable as an observer? And if so, what would cause that?
They certainly can. You could go through, you could learn anything, and you could misapply it or misinterpret it or not practice the skills or use them incorrectly or illegally or unethically, and absolutely do it wrong. When I think about, though, the types of people that self-select into going through a course, such as learning how to read behavior, recognize threats, and the people who self-select into military, law enforcement, security professions, I do default to people have a positive intent and they want to do things the right way and they want to protect, they want to serve. And so by putting this out there, we are enabling them to do that at a higher level. But there's always things that people could do
So
for the wrong reasons.
theoretically,
Yeah,
your your training would actually make someone a better infiltrator as well.
it could. It depends on the security systems maybe that are in place. One of the premises to reading behavior is that, a person's brain can only process so many bits of information at any one point in time. And so if a person is very highly, focused on their own behavior and giving off certain cues, when you talk to that person, you're going to notice some things that don't make sense. There could be delays in their ability to answer the question, or there could be inconsistencies in the way that they talk or the way that they um, explain why they are there. Because if all of their mental attention is on displaying a certain type of behavior, the way they speak verbally, those verbal indicators, it could start to slip there as well. And so when we think about different interview techniques or conversational techniques. When a person starts to focus on their words and answering those questions, that's where we'll oftentimes see the nonverbal indicators start to attract our attention. And so focusing on one oftentimes does reveal those little slips or those anomalous cues on the other channel as well.
See, now this is so fascinating to me because, well, not only are you probably never going to allow me to take your training now, but aside from that, when you talk about these adversaries that, because I'm sure people with bad intent have tried at some point to get into your training for the reasons we're discussing. And you obviously would have a vetting process for that. Has anybody ever gotten past it?
Our training kit is available through our website. Anyone can do it. We don't vet those students, and there's portions of the course, the Marine Corps Combat Hunter course, that are not available to civilians. But the process that we teach, it's not, military specific, it's not law enforcement or security specific. If you have been looking at people, you have been reading your behavior, or you have been reading behavior your entire life. All we're doing is a process and a language to articulate that. And it can be used not only in those security settings, but in, with human resources professionals interviewing candidates for jobs, and sales professionals and customer service. The And then there's the ability to practice those in just everyday situations and scenarios. And so the underlying process to observe behavior, establish baselines, and recognize anomalies, they are things that we wanted to make sure were available to everyone. Because when the Marine Corps Combat Hunter course was created, there weren't many resources available that taught a person how to read behavior and recognize threats with the goal of prevention. There were a ton of resources about how do you survive blasts, how do you survive shootings, but very little on prevention. And that problem was not limited to military, soldiers and Marines and sailors in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's the same problem that we see in schools here at home and public events and gatherings. And so while we took some portions of the course offline that we don't teach to anyone, a majority of the program is unclassified and available to anyone.
That's amazing. Does it frustrate you having the experience that you have, having the knowledge and the training and the practice that you have? Does it frustrate you to go out into the world, quote unquote, and just see people not noticing threats that you see?
Sometimes, right? One of the reasons, we made it the course available kit was, we haven't succeeded yet. There's still school shootings that occur. There are still acts of violence that irrevocably change people's lives. And so it's not like we've gotten to this point of we are so successfully preventing every attack, it's no longer a problem. And so part of me gets frustrated because you can't stop an attack if your face is buried in your cell phone or you're not paying attention to those people around you. But on the other side of that, generally speaking, there's only two types of people who are aware of their surroundings. It's good guys and bad guys. And so when you do see someone now who is, head up and they're looking around and they're clearly assessing or observing the people around them, you also have limited the number of people that you may assess on a train or in a public place like an airport or something like that, because the most people today are just very unaware of their surroundings.
Does your model have any weakness?
Oh, absolutely.
Where would it break, do you think?
The one place that um, it breaks is in the shared understanding of the language and the terminology. So when we train an organization and only, let's say, their frontline staff comes through, but not managers, not supervisors, not people in some sort of operations or command center, there's a ceiling on the performance, because if a person cannot articulate urgency to someone else who cannot see the situation that you're seeing, the whole process breaks, because even if you recognize the threat, you're not able to influence someone else to take action. And this was, especially when we look at organizations, this is a massive limitation, right? There's some of the details are a little bit looser than they were a while ago with the shooting in Appalachia, Georgia, right? A family member called the school to tell them that there was a person on the way to that school with the intent to open fire and kill people. The person who took that call was different than the person who had to make a decision to initiate the lockdown or try to track down that student or start to implement those security procedures. And so when there's a disconnect between the person who recognizes the threat to the person who makes a decision about what to do, and then a disconnect to the people or groups that are going to act left of bank to prevent that attack. If you cannot get everyone moving very quickly, you are just eliminating your left of bang window. And so it's really important that organizations consider the terminology so that they can move through that cycle when the same person is not recognizing threats, deciding and taking action, but when you need other people to do it. And so that's probably the biggest limitation for it
Isn't
when
that
that
how
urgency cannot be conveyed.
organizations though often they send their leaders to a training and it's like this train the trainer thing where the leaders are expected to go back and train their people, but that often doesn't happen. Is that kind of what you're talking about, where you go into an organization to train them and you don't get the people who will be taking the calls, like you say, who will be, you get the decision makers, but not the trench folks?
Mhm. And I think we'll get into this as you talk about the three things that you wanted to talk through. This is what led to a lot of the ways that we're applying the left to bank principles today with organizations and readiness, where when we were first providing this training, it's we would get a lot of call them field level staff, the people on the ground recognizing threats, but we would get very few managers, we would get very few um, ops center, command center, dispatch staff to come through. And there were a number of reasons for that. Sometimes it was, the classes were too big, or, there's a certain point when one instructor or two instructors, you have to kind of cap the number of students if you're going to get them, to a certain level of performance. And, it's what led us to move our course online to make sure that it is, when we work with organizations today, they primarily go through the course online, but because it's in a digital format, there's not a cap to the number of people that could go through the course, and the limiting factor is no longer the instructor, me, or a member that we would teach with, to make sure that we were bypassing that hurdle.
What kinds of organizations do you typically find yourself working with? Is it outside of the standard security, law enforcement, first responders, things like that? Do you work a lot with just corporate teams or small businesses or
Mhm. We work with, I know this is a very broad definition, but anyone whose role and mission is to protect others. All right. So that means we work with city, county, and state level law enforcement. We work with offices of emergency management, primarily at the city or county level. We work with corporate security teams and thinking primarily the facility security. We work with executive protection teams, church and religious center security teams. These concepts have been applied in the cybersecurity industry. We work with businesses who are applying them not to recognize threats, but just better read and understand the people they're running, whether it's a person in a leadership role who's trying to understand their team, or a person in sales who's trying to maybe gain an edge in terms of their ability to read someone that they are presenting to or pitching to. And so it gets applied by anyone who is either preparing their organization or has a direct face-to-face human interaction role in their job, which is um, even with the advancements of technology and AI and everything else, still a lot of people are interacting with others.
so really your work applies across the spectrum because the level of, like you said, the level of mass shootings is so epidemic at this point that it doesn't matter if you're running a bodega or a law enforcement agency, you still have potential threats, even if
Mhm.
the rate of incidence is different or the probability level is different. Do you find that when you work with businesses, do they already have to have a structure, like structural trust or more of a mission command environment for your training to really sink in, or is that something that you end up having to teach along the way?
It depends on where we are coming in to the organization. Sometimes it's we are starting our work at the executive level, helping them identify what are those core capabilities that you need in order to succeed, and whether that's violence prevention or information gathering and analysis and sharing, and or depending on kind of what their purpose is. That is different than when we come in more at the the boots on the ground level with training and things for people that we're seeing. But to your point on it applying to anyone, this was one of the maybe most impactful lessons that I learned as I got out of the Marines. As I started my company, one of our first clients was this elementary school. And we were providing training for the teachers. It wasn't long after Sandy Hook timeframe. And I went in and I taught them as if they were infantry Marines getting ready to deploy to Iraq and Afghanistan. And Kit, I tell you, I have never lost a room so quickly and so decisively as I
I'm
did
not
right then.
laughing at you, I
Yeah.
swear.
Oh, no, it was bad. But after the workshop was done, the principal, like we sat down for hours and he pretty much said, like, you failed in this course. And what he explained though was that people don't become teachers to recognize threats and stop active shooters. There's a different drive that got them here. Now, in this day and age, do they also need to be aware of those active threat scenarios? Absolutely, but it's not what got them here. And that afternoon with that principal, we reworked our entire course where we were starting to apply the behaviors to an educational setting. And then most of the time that we would then spend with teachers after that, we would apply these behaviors to them reading their classroom and understanding which of our students are grasping this, which are having trouble, which group of friends are having problems with each other and are bickering. And then only at the very end would we then say, oh, by the way, the same process that makes you a better educator, a better teacher, this can also be used to recognize threats, and then apply those things that we used and just taught them in a setting that mattered to them and really, really cared about to them, the violence prevention, that security component. And so whenever we, teach now, it's, we try to make sure that we understand where is this going to be applied? What are those motivations? What are those drivers? And build the program around that. And then if the goal is security or violence or anything else, we can then bring those same concepts back to that focus as well.
That is such a fantastic example of healthy embarrassment,
Yeah,
that
I played a
necessary
suicide bomber
feedback.
video to elementary school teachers in a very well off, very low risk community. I think I gave like PTSD with everything. I showed them a very graphic video, and then I lost them for the rest of the day. But
Oh my goodness.
it was humbling to say the least. But it did teach me of going back to understanding that audience, understanding that student, having that as the starting point.
Speaking of reading the room, right?
Oh, I knew. If it makes you feel any better, I did know right away that I was failing. Like there was no doubt in my mind that this was not connecting with the group. But
But you took
yes,
that feedback. I think that's really the important part is that instead of saying, well, you guys obviously don't have the mindset to even grasp this, which you could have done. I can think of people who would have responded that way. And yet you were like, okay, I need to change what I am doing so that this resonates better. And that's a really big deal.
I think. Thank you. I think a piece of that, comes back to it's not, when Jason and I wrote the book, it's not about us. We can't be everywhere. We can't teach everyone. We need people to be able to do this in all sorts of different schools and public venues and parades and religious centers and every place else. It has to be continually adapted and evolved to meet their needs. And I think I said it, towards the beginning of our conversation. When we wrote the book, we talked about the 6 domains of behavior, which is the way that it was taught to deploying Marines. We now teach it as the 4 pillars of behavior, and that came as a result of working with law enforcement agencies where we would teach some concepts in the morning in a classroom setting and then go out into the neighborhoods that they worked in to apply it. And we realized that the language and the terminology that we were teaching was not the language and the terminology they were then using in the field. They would never look at someone and say, the kinesic indicators are this, this, and this, and their biometric cues are this, this, and this. They would talk about the individual is here because of these three reasons. And they wouldn't talk about proxemics. They would talk about the groups of people. And even though the assessments and observations were the same, the language of how they would communicate it back had to match between the way that we talked or the way that we, excuse me, the way that we taught it and then the way that they would operate. And that's what kind of led us to adapt even just the titles and the way that these were discussed to make sure that it more naturally fit into the way that people worked and observed and operated in their jobs.
Well, what you're describing, your work is very academic in the sense that there is a depth to it. And yet you're sitting here saying, okay, I have to, kind of like what we were talking about before I started recording, I have to make this so that anyone can understand it, can apply it, can practice it. Otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah. When we were in the Marines, we would roughly train about every 40 out of every deploying 1,000 Marines. If a Marine battalion of 1,000 Marines was heading overseas, they had to have 40, give or take, Marines trained in the course before their unit became pre-deployment qualified. And we would, teach these courses, and they would deploy, and then we'd come back and we would get a chance to debrief those units and talk to them about what worked. And we'd have these Marines who would come to us and say, something I learned in this course saved my life. I'm here today because of that. I
Wow.
want to come through this course again. And we would have to look at a Marine who was getting ready to deploy, going back into harm's way and say, hey, we are so glad that this helped you. We're so glad that you're interested, but we can't help you because we need to get to a new 40 Marines. We need to expand the number of people who've at least heard this once. And there were no resources that were available to them. There were no, at the time, no real kind of teaching documents, guides, student handout material from the course. There wasn't a lot that was publicly available. And we just, when Jason Riley and I, when we wrote the book, we realized that the situation is unacceptable. We cannot say, hey, you've already had it once. Good luck on the next time so we wrote the book. Then my co-founder and I, then we started our company and started putting a lot of these concepts, adapting them to the civilian audience to make sure that anyone who wants them, anyone who wants to get left of bank can learn how to do it.
Now you've trained people who have then gone on to train others, correct?
Mhm.
If you had to, because obviously the longer that that process goes, the more, I guess, the telephone game eventually has to come into play
Yeah.
and things can get diluted downstream. If you were to kind of circle back and just kind of bring people back to the touchstone and just warn them about one misuse of this, how would you do that? What would you say?
One misuse of the
Yeah,
behaviors or the
one
approach that we
way,
teach.
maybe one way that you see it get diluted a lot as it gets more and more levels downstream that you kind of want to just set
Yeah.
again.
You never have perfect certainty about a person's intentions, right? When we are talking about operating left of bank, operating earlier on the timeline, we are making informed judgments about what we believe a person's intentions are. And the decision process that we use, the heuristic that went into the baseline plus anomaly equals decision structure and the behaviors are designed to make decisions that are more often right than wrong, but not perfect decisions. And so when you think about what those decisions you make, if you are looking at an individual and you assess them as an anomaly, right, you still have, if you feel that they're an imminent threat, by all means, do what is needed to stop that threat and protect people. But if there is a doubt and there is no imminent threat, more often than not, you have to have a conversation with that person to start to understand, are they, if you're to put this into a school setting, if you're looking at a fourth grader coming through the front door of your school who is displaying uncomfortable cues and your baseline is people in the comfortable cluster, a kid displaying discomfort does not say we should, you know, tackle this kid because it's an anomaly. It's, well, maybe we have a conversation. Are they nervous because they have a gun in their backpack? Or are they nervous because they just watched mom and dad have a fight? Or they have a test or a quiz and they didn't prepare for it? They're worried about a social interaction with one of their friends who they just had a fight with. There's a lot of reasons why someone could do that or someone could be behaving given that, given the behavior that we're observing. And so we are not mind readers, and we have to keep that humility and take that humility into account when we're then thinking about what decision do we need to make. You should do something. If your baseline is comfort and you're seeing that person, that child who is uncomfortable, a decision is necessary. But what decision you make to either confirm that, yep, we are correct that there is a problem, or no, this is a false positive. There's other legitimate reasons why this person is displaying that behavior. And sometimes when people jump or they're more confident than they should be in the intentions that a person has is when they run into trouble.
So let's flip this a little and talk about, I know church security teams are a big thing now.
Mhm.
And thank God for that, for the record. But if a church is often described as a hospital for people who are searching or who are uncomfortable or struggling with various issues, how do you teach the churches that you work with to balance that where it looks like it might be a threat, but I need more context? Is it the same principle where you're just walking up and talking to them and kind of assessing them from there?
Yeah, and let's say you're observing someone who is displaying what we call the dominant cluster of behavior. These are people whose body is the fight response to stresses and threats has been activated, right? And they're displaying these indicators that make them look larger, making them look more aggressive, or leading you to believe that they are confrontational in the moment. When I say that you should go up and have a conversation with them, it does not mean, hey, put yourself into a position of weakness, make yourself vulnerable, put yourself into a spot where you cannot defend yourself. But it does let you say, of these 100 people walking through the door, this person requires a conversation. And maybe it's making sure that there is some sort of overwatch or protection, or that you're going up in a group to make sure that if this person does become violent, there's enough people there or support to stop the threat. But when you think about what de-escalation is, right? All we're talking about when you hear people talk about de-escalation is taking someone who's displaying the dominant cluster behavior and finding a way to get them to either display comfort or submissive behavior. That's it. And you're taking them through this progression. And if someone is truly they're displaying dominance and for it's a legitimate reason, I struggle to think of what those might be in the moment. But if they start to calm down, then you realize that maybe things are okay. This person maybe just needs help or needs some assistance, or they just had a really bad morning, whatever that is. When a person is not able to de-escalate, they are not able to calm down, then you start to end up in a situation with greater confidence that there is a confrontation, or there's a fight, or there's something else happening here. And at that point, maybe you call in more support, or you start to take different action, or separate this person from the crowd, or whatever those kind of contingency plans would be to protect others. But through that conversation, you can start to get a better read on what is the cause of this behavior. And is it violent, or is it a false positive?
This is all amazing. I could talk to you all day, but I'm looking at the time, and so I really want to get to this one last question. What
Okay.
is the next layer that you're thinking about?
Where a lot of our work is today is focusing on the executive level and the strategic application of the principles that we talked about left to bang. And this comes from the way organizations are preparing for the future. And this could be developing capabilities such as violence prevention or security capabilities. This could be, you know, business development or fundraising or evacuation, whatever mission your organization has, and thinking about how are you building very intentionally, very deliberately, the capabilities that you will need to succeed in the future. And what led us down this path, it's, when we were first teaching this course, when we had first started our company, we kept sometimes running into a ceiling that we talked about where we were training field level staff, but not the supervisors. And the reality is, for most supervisors, it wasn't important for them in 90% of their job. It was only something that they needed, when there was a problem or situation or incident in the field. And by applying these different principles, we started to the different layers, we started to realize that for most organizations, it's simply safer to prepare right of bang, meaning they wait for an incident to occur, then they realize that they have a gap, and then they start to develop that. And it is safer for organizations politically and credibility and reputations. It is not safer for those people who might have gotten hurt or injured or killed during that incident. But what I mean is, you can when you can bring an executive team together and you look at something that happened and it was bad and that it was, proved that your organization wasn't ready, there's no real pushback in terms of, yeah, we should invest in this capability or we should invest in our readiness because it failed. That is a very different equation when you are looking forward of, even though an attack hasn't happened here, it could happen here. And when people start to make those recommendations to those senior leadership teams of, we need to get ready for this, even though it hasn't happened here, people put their credibility on the line, which is internal to organizations. It is their, that is their currency. It is the thing that capable, competent people have to drive change. And when there's not that language, not the ability to explain why there's this gap, those initiatives and those projects stall because people can't get the buy-in and the support needed to truly change their organization. And early on, when I started the company, this would frustrate me a great deal of like, why can't we get executives and senior leaders to see the need for this beyond those field ground level, people that we were training who were all in on it. And those, just this realization that until those groups, those mid-level managers, those senior executives, until they have an application of this that helps them day to day, then they can build the structures that are needed to truly make this an organizational mindset and the culture around being proactive and getting left to bang. And so it took a number of years to really see, what we call now the three levels of left to bang, whether we're at the individual level, operational level, or the strategic level of organizations. But now that we are focused there and have ways that executives can put this into practice themselves, we're starting to now see those shifts where it can truly connect people from, across the entire org chart inside a company or team or nonprofit or public safety agency.
You wrote about this morning. I
I
just
did.
read it before we came on here. So
Uh-oh.
I want to tell people, hey, if you want to know more about that, go read his Substack. He literally wrote about it this morning. Where can people find the rest of your work? Obviously, you've got the CP Journal and Substack. Where else can
Mhm.
they find training and more resources?
Everything is now available through the CP Journal. We host it on Substack, but we made this decision to we moved our entire business over to that platform. So um, content, articles, resources that are both available for free, or some of our courses that are um, behind a paywall, and some other resources for our Academy subscribers. Everything is available through the CP Journal at cp-journal.com. And we started that site to make sure that these concepts were not only accessible, to people, but also to share how they're continuing to adapt and evolve with more use. When we write a book, that book was published 2014 now, and that's a point in time of the application of this. And through our site, with each different client we work with, we find different ways that we can apply this and tweak this and adapt those concepts to make sure that is not only relevant to a larger and larger audience, but also in ways that people can learn alongside us as well.
So it's a living system. You didn't just create the
Mhm.
system and throw it out like chum in the water and go, okay, there you go. This has been an ongoing journey and it will continue to be an ongoing journey.
It is, and I mentioned this when I wrote Left to Bang. I talked about how angry I was the first time I saw the Combat Hunter course, and I say that because I had already done my deployments in the Marines, and the Combat Hunter course existed before I became an instructor. And for the first time I sat through the course, I was just thinking about the situations, the incidents, the experiences that I had overseas that were stressful in the sense of, we're dealing with some threats and some issues and some missions that were really hard for us to accomplish. And yet this course existed. This could have helped us. This could have probably changed the way that we interacted, with certain local villagers that we were talking to who were probably in hindsight the insurgents, the terrorists that we were looking for, but it wasn't available to everyone. Probably only 40 Marines out of our deploying 1,000 got to go through. I didn't even hear of the course before that. And it made me so angry that I could be at risk. It's not just being the at risk part. That's what people in the military sign up for. But there's also mitigating and managing that risk and providing people with the skills and the abilities and the tools that they need to not be reactive, not to let our adversaries have the upper hand. And that is what led us to write the book, to make sure that anyone who write the book and start, the company was anyone who wants to learn how to do this, they don't have to look very far. We can provide it to them.
Patrick, thank you so much for coming on. This has been the best hour of my week. I appreciate you so much. And hopefully people check out your work and sign up for your training because I think everyone needs it, regardless of the position in life that they're in. It can never be bad to learn how to see threats better and to act more proactively and intelligently in it.
Well, I appreciate the chance to come on for the conversation, Kit, truly.
At every level that Patrick talked about, whether it's individual observer, operational team, executive leadership, it doesn't matter. The breakdown isn't in the ability to see, because anybody can be taught to see. The failure mode can be found in the ability to act on what you see, with enough shared understanding and speed to change the outcome. That's a problem that gray cell practitioners will recognize as well. The structure of the failure is the same, whether you're talking about physical threat detection, organizational infiltration, or even institutional drift. Perception without shared context produces nothing but noise. Patrick has taken an existing military system and evolved it to civilian work, and by his own description, it's still evolving. I think his story about teaching and losing the school teachers is a pretty important point. It shows several things in a real-world situation: humility, healthy embarrassment, and the necessary course corrections that come from them. Patrick can tell you about his doctorate, but that story tells you a little something about Patrick, and it tells me that he's worth listening to. If you want to go deeper on his work, you can go to cp-journal.com. The training is available to all paid members of the CP Journal Substack, and I highly recommend it. It is absolutely worth your time. It seems fitting that I close out the first season of Change the Game with this episode. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the Shepherd's Sale community. Season 2 will start again in the fall. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe at shepherdscale.substack.com or visit graycellsystems.com to stay updated on my research. Until next time, this has been Change the Game.